I've been teaching, amongst other things, teaching photography at FIU for 47 years.
Okay.
Well, I love looking at photographs. When I was a kid, my parents had picture magazines, Life magazine, Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post, other popular mechanics, and so I was always around photographs. My grandfather photographed, and he had National Geographic. And I was of the TV age, and so looking at pictures, looking at TV, and those kinds of things were part of my growing up, much like smartphones and that kind of thing is very familiar to your generation. Well, you know, I had little cameras when I was a kid, little Hawkeye cameras and so forth. Later, when I was in my 20s, I was interested in photography. At one point, I borrowed a friend's camera and photographed football games where I went to school. But then I got a master's degree in teaching, and so I taught 7th grade English. I taught English and creative writing in a high school, and taught English in a little college in Kansas for a couple of years, and realized that I really loved teaching, but it wasn't going to be English. So then I went to Chicago to the Institute of Design for 2 years, and that's where I ran into a major influence, which was this guy, Gary Winogrand. He was a photographer who was part of the turning of the aesthetics of photography in the 1960s toward a documentary style. Photographers who photographed very personal things that they were interested in, but photographed in an unfancy way, in a way that almost the way photojournalists would photograph. And he was my teacher there for 1 year and was very influential in what I understood about photography. Well, I think it pertains more than anything to the perception that the photographer has to bring to bear. That is, if one is photographing seriously with, say, black and white film, you begin to have an understanding of how whatever you point the camera at is going to look like in black and white. While with color, there's a whole different set of antennas that one must have attuned to the nature of whatever the color is that's in front of them in terms of what they're photographing. For the most part, people make color photographs, but how much does the color count? I mean, the color has to be part of the meaning of the photograph. It's not just that the subjects are colorful, but that the color pertains to the visual meaning of the photograph, how it looks. A lot of people think good color photography is just with a lot of colors in it or colorful subjects, but it can be very soft or monochromatic almost. Well, maybe we're not talking about techniques, but approaches, ways that photographers work. There are techniques pertaining to how one processes film and makes prints, or how one modifies digital files in Photoshop or other ways of manipulating digital files. But I think it's, on the one hand, someone like Winogrand, for example, photographed in the street and found things that were interesting to him and the people in the streets and so forth. Another photographer might be interested in portraiture, where there's this really deep interchange between the photographer and the subject in terms of how the subject is depicted in the portraits. Other people might stage photographs, might arrange them in sometimes elaborate ways. Or there are photographers, for example, who make models of the real world and photograph them, and they're so convincing that they look real. There are lots of different ways that one might make pictures that we call photographs. So it depends on how you are working. You're working with a handheld camera in the streets and out in the world, working with a digital camera, or working with models and so forth. Sometimes we're inclined to want to make guesses about what might have happened before or after, or what's going on, when in fact it's better to stay with the photograph. As you know, in classes, for example, some of the time there's this idea of that one other guy came up with, if anyone says anything about their photograph that we can't tell from their photograph, that they have to buy the class coffee and donuts or whatever. In other words, if there's a photograph of a guy on a bicycle and I say it's my brother on a bicycle, we don't know that from the photograph that it's his or her brother. But if we say it's a guy on a bicycle, well, we're staying with the photograph. So the photograph, one idea that this guy Winogrand had was that the photograph has to be better than what is photographed. One great example would be the photographs made by a Frenchman named Eugene Atget, who in the 1920s photographed the storefronts of chic Parisian shops with the reflections of the old architecture in the window. So it's a kind of a found double exposure, if you like. Lee Friedlander, picking up on that idea, has done a whole world of photographs connected with the play between the reflections in windows and what's reflected behind it and what's inside the store or storefront, or what's inside the room on the other side of the glass. I don't think a teacher really teaches photography as such. I mean, you might try to help people be more skilled with the equipment that they're using or something like that. But I think rather than teach photography, you're trying to encourage people to look at things in a certain way. The mechanism of photography is fairly easy. Even black and white photography, which is more connected with developing film and those kinds of things, if you're doing it yourself and printing yourself, requires the development of a certain amount of skill, but it's not that difficult. So the question then is, what do you photograph and how do you photograph it? And so I don't think you learn from a teacher teaching you about how to run the camera or something like that. What you learn is what you learn from looking at photographs. And then in that process, you begin to understand what you want your own photographs to look like and what you want them to be about. And it's a mysterious process. Sometimes it just comes to you out of nowhere. In other cases, it's something that someone has to search for very carefully. I've never enjoyed exhibitions. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of trouble putting things together. There's an opening and, these conversations that are fragmented all the time. But I think for people to look at photographs, it's an important way to look at photographs. Books, of course, are probably even a better way. Now, in some cases, particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades, we see the rise of people like this guy Gursky of the Dusseldorf School of Photography, whose photographs might be 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide, or even bigger than that, maybe a lot bigger than that. And so there's another kind of an issue there about the experience of looking at the work itself. In some cases, you can look at a book of photographs and get the full experience of looking at the photographs. In other cases, to see them in exhibitions is revealing. You might, for example, take a look at this current exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City about the photographer Wolfgang Tillmans. And in some cases, the photographs are 8 feet tall. In some cases, they're little small prints that aren't even framed. They're just stuck on the wall in a certain kind of way. So there are all kinds of ways. In some cases, someone would want a very uniform kind of exhibition. In other cases, there's ways to make it much different than that.
But thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right.
And that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.